Indeed, it's been many years, but we still look the same, I guess. And it's wonderful to see that. It's wonderful to be able to connect again and to break the boundary of time also. Um, and it's also interesting that we're talking about boundaries because when we talk about boundaries, we maybe think about the physical and then the non-physical boundaries. So maybe in terms of architecture, we would say that it's about the inside-outside relationship and then maybe the walls, the windows, the physical manifestations in architecture. But beyond that also, there is this other side of boundary, which is about the non-physical, which is maybe more the mental or the psychological boundary, whereby we have our perceptions and then we also have a certain set of beliefs inherent in us because of the cultural baggage we have, where we come from, and all the experiences that we have experienced so far. So we have these as our boundaries also. So at the moment, I'm in Singapore. I originally was born in the Philippines, but I've spent a longer time in Japan compared to my time in the Philippines. So it somehow maybe makes me inherently a little bit weird or different. And some of the students were saying that, oh, you're a nomad. And so I was thinking about that. That means that the nomad has some boundaries, I guess, on how you move from place to place. And so it's good to reflect on maybe all these boundaries that we have. So we normally would react to certain situations based on what we have behind us. And then there's a saying that when you're in Rome, you try to do as the Romans do. So wherever we are, we try to adapt. But in adapting, we are somehow colored by the things that we have with us. So maybe that could be a starting point in the conversation on boundaries. It's also fascinating that when we talk about boundaries, we tend to imagine space, which automatically would translate to architectural ideas again. Because again, in order for us to maybe understand space, we would have to have these set boundaries, which usually would be in architecture about walls, floors, ceilings, the windows, the openings, and then how you frame this. But at the same time, we also have this uh, element which is about time itself. So like now we're having a conversation, we have to cross the boundary of the international dateline because it's yesterday for me where you are, and then it's tomorrow for you where I am. So it's a very interesting phenomena also to think about all these things. And um, as I said previously, Japan holds a strong influence on me. So like every now and then I would be back, and then so when I'm thinking about boundaries, I would imagine being in the garden of Ryowanji, the sand garden, and then the 15 stones, which you never see 15, but you only see 14, and then all these little metaphysical stories behind the things that we see, and then the things that are unseen. Yes, it's fascinating that when in Japan, as a foreigner, one would always want to become Japanese in a certain way. But at a certain point, you have to realize that you will never become Japanese. And so the acceptance of being non-Japanese and being a foreigner and just being who you are is a very important step, I think. And so I think that's one boundary that one has to cross while being in Japan. And so to translate that physically, maybe in terms of architecture, it is interesting that we learn from when we were in University of Tokyo, we were learning with Professor Koyama, with Professor Maki, and then across town we have Professor Shinohara in Tokodai, and so they all have different ways of maybe talking about boundaries also, and then maybe using tradition, uh, uh, especially Japanese tradition in crafting architecture. And I think that maybe Professor Maki would talk about oku, and it's something that I still cannot maybe say that I really understand it. I still don't understand it, but it's something like a layering and going deeper and deeper into certain things that maybe is how I could describe it physically. But of course, before all these encounters at the University of Tokyo, I was in Kyoto, and so being in Kyoto, I was doing my master's there, and then I also had opportunity to apprentice in Tadao Ando's office. So spending the time with Tadao Ando has been quite fascinating also because he was using a material called concrete to define spaces, and it seems the wall is a very important part of his architecture. And it seems like it's a contrary that he would be using the wall and concrete to be uh, doing architecture in Japan, when maybe for most people there is this concept that there is really no wall in Japanese architecture, that you only have the paper screens, and then and 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 also the layering of spaces inside and outside with maybe the engawa or the surrounding spaces around it. But if you would look very closely, Mr. Ando's work is also in many ways very Japanese in certain ways because of how the spaces are actually uh, used, and then the ideas on how the spaces are crafted. So I guess it's that mental landscape and mental boundary that he would be working on, and then expressed in a different physical manifestation. So these are thoughts that would come to mind. And of course, what is helpful in maybe understanding all these was that besides doing my architectural studies when I was in Kyoto, I found myself being immersed in doing tea ceremony. Maybe the main reason was that I wanted to learn how maybe space is crafted and then how it affects maybe behavior. But I think that maybe for the tea ceremony and the tea room, it's actually the opposite. It's the ceremony that affects the behavior, the space that actually uh, affects the behavior. And in many ways, it would mean that living life itself, because it is not only the ritual of doing the tea, but also the space, and then the season, the time. And so the food, the conversation, the words that you use while being in the tea room are all defined by the season also, and then by the occasion. And then everything seems to be carefully measured. So the number of tatamis that you have in the tea room, or even in the placement of your bowls, placement of things, these are actually carefully measured in relation to the number of strands in the weaving in the tea room, in the tatami. So you will have to place everything very properly to where they should be placed. So I guess maybe one can say that these are boundaries, or maybe the rules that actually govern how one would do things. So in that sense, by doing tea ceremony, one also would be uh, somehow encouraged to do flower arrangement. One have to understand flower arrangement, and then one would have to understand the making of haiku or songs, because that would be part of all the ceremony. And then learning how to appreciate the tea bowls, also how they are made, and then also uh, all these other things that are in the space of the tea room, how light enters, how you position yourself, how you enter the tea room from the outside to inside, and having that little nijiriguchi to actually maybe humble yourself and then go into the tea room. So it's a very small entrance to the tea room that separates the outside and then the inside world. And in the outside world, you have to somehow go through the garden to actually maybe maybe look at nature, enjoy nature, prepare yourself to go in, and then you have to clean yourself. The ablution, I guess, that you wash, and then you go into the tea room, and then in the tea room you can be what you are supposed to be, as natural as can be, and have a good conversation with the host while enjoying the tea that is being prepared. Our own body, we are the boundary ourselves.
Right.
We actually create the boundary physically, as you said, moving from space to space, and then also mentally by also imagining the past in order for us to get to the future. by being here now, and maybe it's um, yeah, we are the boundary ourselves. I think that, yeah, when you were speaking and then talking about Mr. Ando, I was also talking about, I mean, I was thinking about Frank Lloyd Wright also, that when we go to his works, um, we would think that they're high spaces, but actually they're not. The ceiling spaces are actually very low, which I think would be very similar to Japanese houses also. Um, and I think that maybe it's again going back to the body, related to the body itself, the height we have, and then the eye level that we have, and then it affects our perception of space itself. And it's very different from maybe visiting projects by Le Corbusier, because like last summer we brought our students to do a discovery of Le Corbusier, and it's interesting to see the height of the spaces in his projects, which I think was also very different from the height of the space of his mother's house, which was more intimate, and even the apartment where he lives in, the height of the space was also very different. So it's some sort of a different boundary, I guess, maybe because he was thinking about how he would want it to be more bright and sunny, when it would be very different perhaps for his mother. Well, I mean, maybe the height of the mother or what. So it's just a thought that came. And then, so when one is thinking about this, one, as your question, who are maybe in the contemporary scene of architecture, who could be interesting people to, who are really working on boundaries? I think there are many of them. Of course, Japan would have many architects which who are working on this, as many people would know them. Um, uh, there are young architects which are who are very interesting for me, and then maybe not so famous yet. So I feel that, of course, Sejima, Nishizawa, they're all very famous, but I would like to maybe look at the people who are the children of the children of Nishizawa and Sejima, um, and um, like maybe the younger ones now, like I mean, they've worked with Mr. Ito also before. Uh, you have Fujimura Yuji also, who operates maybe in a different sense by having this conversation with the people who are stakeholders in the design that he is making, and then trying to use computation in all this. So I mean, the digital realm also comes into the conversation in trying to make uh, the projects that they do. Another person could be Tsuyoshi Tane. I mean, he was working in France, and then he did the National Museum in Estonia, and now he's working in Japan. So again, it's a very cross-cultural way of operating. So again, boundaries in a different sense itself also, of not only in physically in architecture, but in the way of operating in architecture. And then maybe in Singapore, one architect is Ling Hao, and I think it was exhibited in the Toto Gallery Ma 30th anniversary exhibition. He is actually from Kuching, Malaysia, but he's living and operating in Singapore. And he keeps on thinking about maybe how we live, and then the spaces we lived in, and then the, the, the effects of all these phases that we've been through in our memories to actually create the things that we do. So he does a very fascinating work also, that also again would maybe define that ambiguity between the inside and outside in the tropics, or maybe in Malaysia, Singapore, or Thailand, or in Southeast Asia. So seemingly the boundaries more porous, you have these layers of spaces in between, and then maybe the projects don't look very uh, finished, but actually they're in the process of still being constructed. And so I think that these are some of the architects that would immediately come to mind at the moment. And again, I think that when they speak, as you said, maybe it's the journey. It's this wave of you moving from one space to another space, which actually define many of the projects and the experience of this architectural explorations.
It's interesting. You,
I guess that in Singapore, one of the prime houses that one would want to live in are what are called the black and white bungalows. And so these were houses that were built for the British officials who, when they lived in Singapore, so they're raised on stilts. And so the reason why they're black and white is because they're colored white. And then I think the roof is black and with black frames, and so they're called black and white. But again, they are on stilts, so wind can pass below, and then they're surrounded by veranda, or maybe in Japanese we call engawa. So you have that space in between, the inside and outside, and so by having that space and then the shutters, it means that you are able to control the flow of the wind, and then also the intensity of light that would come in. And so I think that just by having a dimmer light and then with the wind passing in, it means it will cool you down. So some architects actually have been using this and expressing them in some of their works. Like for example, one of the very famous architectural firms in Singapore is called Wuha, uh, WOHA, Wuha. And so they've done many projects and even done skyscrapers. And then the Molman Rise is one prime example. It was given the Aga Khan Award because of these, that they actually incorporated the tropical window, whereby normally the windows are placed vertically, and when it rains, when your windows are open, it means the water will come in. But what Wuha did was actually to place the wind uh, channel where on the horizontal one, so that the wind can actually come in, and so even if it's raining, it does not come into your house. So that's one of the measures that they have done to actually bring this inside outside, bringing the wind and then bringing the I mean letting keeping out the rain. So maybe that was one of the things that they have. But I think one of the main tools that people have maybe in Singapore is actually to have that space in between the outside and then the inside, to actually control the wind, the rain, and then the intensity of light. Because maybe in the tropics, when it rains, it does not rain vertical, it rains horizontal. Yes. So these are some of the things which are fascinating, I think. And strangely, um, for the foreigners in Singapore, everyone wants to stay outside and enjoy the outside. But usually for Singaporeans, they prefer to be inside, to be in the air-conditioned room. But again, this situation is somehow being challenged by the conditions that COVID-19 poses on us. So we have to think about uh, passive cooling, ventilation, flow of air, so that you keep a very healthy environment for you to be in, so that you don't really nurture the culture of the viruses, etc. So again, how air flows, how the wind would be moving are very prime considerations, I guess, in this new time where we have the boundary of safe distancing, where we have to keep 1 meter apart and then and behave in certain ways in public spaces. A very fascinating thing to think about, because with the technology, the digital technology that we have, we seem to be very connected, and then it seems like it's very homogeneous and similar to everywhere. But if we look very closely, it's actually also very different for each of us because of the particular conditions that we are in. And you may think of an idea, and then I would hear it, and then when I hear it, I would somehow think about it and interpret it in my way. And so maybe I would be appropriating it in a certain way, and it becomes maybe my own. And then, but I would have to acknowledge that it actually came from you, which is, I think, the proper way to maybe deal with these things. And so I think that because of that, despite the seeming homogeneity of all these things, we're actually very diverse also. And with this situation where we have the safe distancing, and then where we have this conversation through Zoom, we also become more conscious of who we are. and then we become more conscious of our neighbors. I become more conscious of who you are and then where you are. And so I can see that maybe it has become a little bit cloudy where you are in your background now. And I think that in that way, it doesn't really mean that we are all the same, but actually more conscious of our own identities. We become more conscious of who our neighbors and how they behave, and maybe more caring for each other. And then by being in that, I think that maybe we can build a better world in the future, rather than maybe before, whereby we tend to say that okay, it's just us and then them,
Mm.
and okay, whatever they have, whatever we have. But I think that in order for us to thrive, I think that we should be open, I guess, to accepting what others can offer, and then maybe working on them to actually be uh, suitable for us. So I was just reading yesterday. I don't know if this one applies here, but I was reading something whereby uh, someone was talking about Gite, that the inheritance you have from your father is not yours until you work for it. So that means that whatever we have, that means that even all the ideas that we have, it only becomes wonderful and us if we actually take it as our own. And so I think that we are born in this world with, some people say nothing, but actually we take in many things from our parents, from people behind us. And so I think that this also forms us. And then by working on this to actually define ourselves, then we contribute to maybe defining something that would help in creating this better world, in understanding the nature around us, and then how we can work with it, in understanding our friends, our even our enemies, if we have enemies, or the people we don't like. By understanding them, I think that we are able to maybe help and make things um, better, as we say in my university, to help create a better world by design, by technology, and then by design. I was just reading this book called Microcosmos, and by Leanne Margolis and another person, and it talks about how the virus or the bacteria or the cell uh, somehow goes through this process. Sometimes it's very destructive, and then it gives rise to another entity, another element. And it's also very similar to our DNA also, whereby there's a certain sequence. And then every now and then, if the sequence is changed a little bit, it gives rise to another one. So I think that that's maybe part of the evolution that we have been going through.
Right.
And then, and in order for us to understand that, I think that we have to be ourselves, because we are the boundary between comprehension and incomprehension. We are the boundary between enlightenment and non-enlightenment, I think.
Right.
So we will be able to feel that, I guess.